Hello, my creatures of the night. I am thrilled you stopped by today. I was just saying earlier how I had a new story to tell, and you showed up at the perfect time. Take a second, get comfortable, and just let everything else fade out for a little bit while we dive into tonight's case together. Tonight, we are looking at a property in Fort Wayne, Indiana, known locally as the State House. It is one of those places that does not really make sense in isolation. Nothing about it stands out at first glance. No dramatic architecture. No obvious history that would immediately explain why people still talk about it. And yet, they do. Not because of one event, but because of what keeps getting reported over time. A family moved into this property in the late 1980s and ended up staying for 35 years. Over those 3 decades, they were subjected to a relentless string of paranormal activity. We are not just talking about the occasional unexplained thump in the night. The family members reported seeing full-body apparitions on a regular basis. There were specific spots in the residence that everyone universally avoided. The basement, for instance, was considered absolute no man's land. No one went down there unless they had to, and if they did, they never stayed long. The main staircase and the upstairs washroom were just as bad. The family described the constant, overwhelming sensation of something standing directly behind them. The children used to physically sprint up the stairs because the feeling of being chased was so intense. But the most disturbing detail from the family's time there involves a young boy entity. This spirit did not just make noise. It would perfectly mimic the exact voice of one of the sons calling out from empty rooms. To live with that level of psychological manipulation for 35 years is entirely beyond my comprehension. Through the white noise, a disembodied voice clearly and plainly responded, "I have waited for years." Less than a minute later, the audio picked up the distinct faint sound of a young boy laughing in the distance. When you remember the family's stories about the entity that mimicked voices, hearing that laughter captured on audio is incredibly chilling. Seeking direct answers, the investigator went back up to the portal room on the 2nd floor. He placed a simple yes or no communication device on the ground. The silence in the house was absolute until he asked if anything was in the room with him. Right on cue, a massive, heavy knock echoed from the hallway right outside the bedroom door. The device immediately lit up green, confirming a presence. He then asked the entity a very direct question. "Do you like people coming here to communicate with you?" The device instantly flashed red for no. It was an immediate, firm rejection. The message was loud and clear that they did not want company. Right after that response, the audio picked up what sounded exactly like heavy footsteps rushing down the wooden staircase. Despite being clearly told to leave, he forced himself to check the basement. Remember, this was the area the family completely avoided for over 3 decades. He went down into the dark, set up a digital voice recorder, and asked for a name. Nothing happened. It was completely dead. But honestly, watching the footage, that heavy, suffocating silence feels so much worse than a sudden jump scare. It is the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, where you know something is watching you. But it refuses to give you the satisfaction of revealing itself. To wrap up the night, he decided to try one last experiment. He set up a laser tracking grid down the main corridor of the house. This grid projects a massive net of green lasers that instantly detect any physical mass moving through the space. He left the cameras rolling and completely exited the building for 30 minutes, letting the equipment run in total isolation. When he finally came back inside to pack up his gear, things went entirely off the rails. He was standing in the living area, giving his closing thoughts to the camera, completely ready to leave. Suddenly, the laser grid on the monitor started spiking wildly. A solid, invisible mass was standing directly in the center of the hallway. As he scrambled to grab his equipment and get out, the sensors just kept triggering over and over again, right behind him. Whatever was in that house had followed him to the door to make sure he was actually leaving. He abandoned his composure, grabbed the camera, and walked straight out into the night. The State House is clearly heavily occupied, and whatever resides there has absolutely zero interest in entertaining guests. Interestingly enough, despite the heavy activity, the family recently opened the property to the public as a paranormal research center. You can actually book an overnight stay by directly messaging their Facebook page, the State House LLC. A weekend stay on a Friday or Saturday costs $175 for up to 5 people, while Sunday through Thursday will run you $100. They do require a $50 non-refundable deposit up front to secure your reservation, and $35 fee for each extra guest. So, if you want to test your luck in that dark basement, the option is there for anyone willing to pay the entry fee. Let me know what you think about this case down in the comments. Would you have lasted 35 years in a house like that? Or would you book a stay there now? Let's move on to the next house. Most people call the Whaley House America's most haunted house. You hear that title thrown around a lot, but this isn't just marketing. When you look at the architecture, it's a standard mid-19th century Greek revival home in Old Town, San Diego. It doesn't look menacing, but the history written into the very foundation of this land is not just tragic, it's violent. Before the house was even built, this plot of land was the site of public executions. It wasn't just a random field, it was a place where people were brought to meet their end by the state. One of the most infamous figures here was a man named Yankee Jim Robinson. In 1852, he was hanged on these grounds because the executioners miscalculated his height. The rope was too short. He didn't die quickly. He spent 45 minutes slowly strangling, his feet scraping the dirt of the very ground that the house would later be built upon. When Thomas Whaley bought this land in 1855, he knew the history. He saw the gallows, and yet he proceeded to build his life, his business, and his family home right on top of that trauma. It's almost like he ignored the warning signs that the land was already spoken for. From the moment the family moved in, things began to unravel. Anna, Thomas's wife, would write letters to him while he was away on business, mentioning being startled out of her sleep by the sound of footsteps that she thought were his, only to realize she was entirely alone in the house. These weren't just bumps. These were the heavy, distinct, dragging footsteps of someone much heavier than a spirit. But the tragedy wasn't just ghostly, it was personal. Their 18-month-old son, Thomas Jr., died of scarlet fever in the house. Shortly after, a devastating fire wiped out their store and their savings. The family fled to San Francisco, trying to escape the darkness, but they were eventually pulled back. That was their fatal mistake. The most heart-wrenching part of this story is their daughter, Violet. After being conned into a marriage by a man who only wanted the family fortune, she was left publicly humiliated and broken. She suffered from deep depression, and after an initial failed attempt, She eventually self-exited in the backyard with her father's. Imagine living in a house where every room, every hallway is a monument to the worst day of your life. The energy in Violet's room is still described today as suffocating. It's an emotional echo that hasn't found silence. Recently, an investigation team returned to this house to see if the spirits remained. The moment they stepped through the front door, they experienced something physically impossible. They reported a sudden, violent sensation of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped 6 inches beneath them. It wasn't just a dizzy spell, it was a full-body physical reaction. They set up their equipment in the area where the gallows once stood. Throughout the night, they were subjected to terrifying, disembodied screams. These weren't just faint whispers. They were loud, blood-curdling sounds that seemed to rise in pitch, as if someone was suffering in real time. The most unsettling moment came when 2 investigators saw the same thing with their own eyes. A massive, basketball-sized ball of light manifesting in the doorway of the bedroom. It moved with intelligence. It ducked behind objects, tracked them, and reacted to their presence. They weren't looking at a camera glitch. They were looking at a conscious entity. When they finally brought out the communication devices, the spirits began to identify themselves. They received words like Jim, Violet, and property. When asked about the curse of the land, the device answered with disaster and property. It was as if the spirits were confirming that the location itself, the earth beneath their feet, was the source of the nightmare. The Whaley House doesn't feel like an empty building. It feels like a stage where the play never ends. The spirits here aren't just echoes of the past. They are active participants in the present. When you visit a place like this, you have to ask yourself, are we just observers, or are we intruding on a cycle of pain that we have no business touching? The fact that this family lived, died, and suffered here, and that the public is now invited to stay overnight in those same rooms, creates a very strange, very heavy dynamic. To wrap up this story, we have to address the reality of what lingers here. The Whaley House is not just a building, it is a testament to the idea that some memories are too heavy to be forgotten and some tragedies are too deep to ever truly be buried. When you strip away the ghost stories and the EVP sessions, you are left with a simple, unsettling truth. We are guests in a home that never stopped mourning. Whether you believe in the spectral voices of the Whaley family or the lingering aggressive energy of a criminal long dead, the atmosphere is undeniable. It is a place that demands a certain level of respect, not because of the ghosts, but because of the genuine human suffering that saturated the soil. If you ever find yourself in Old Town standing in front of that white balcony, take a moment to consider the weight of the air around you. Some histories are meant to be remembered, but perhaps others, the ones that refuse to leave, are better left alone. Could you spend a night in that house, knowing exactly what happened in the very room you were sleeping in? Or is some history just too heavy to be disturbed? Let me know in the comments. This has been Houses That Haunt. I will see you in the next investigation.